Joining us to discuss this further is Matthew Lesh, who's head of research at the Adam Smith Institute, a neoliberal think tank and lobbying group based in the UK. Thanks for joining us this morning. Matthew, from what you've seen so far, how do we expect people to behave, basically, in terms of these new restrictions? People have been emailing in this morning saying they do not want to comply with any new restrictions that coming, having gone through, a number of lockdowns in the past. Do you think we're likely to see compliance abating?
Look, I think this, to begin with, this variant is serious, but it's not worth panicking about. But from everything we know about it, does seem like it to some extent it is going to be quite transmittable. It's already arrived into the country, even with the bans of travel from South Africa and countries. And the reality of it is that we're going to have to depend on the safeguards that we now have, which we didn't have a year ago when we were in December, which is the vaccines, which are still going to likely provide a reasonable level of protection, particularly now with boosters likely to be approved across the population. Are people willing to comply with restrictions? Well, I think increasingly less so. You see this anecdotally quite a lot, that whilst masks have been compulsory for quite some time on, let's say, transport for London services, let's say a majority haven't been wearing them. As well as people have kind of got back to normal life. The fundamental question, though, is what is necessary and reasonable? Is it reasonable to bring in more restrictions at this point in time? And I don't think, beyond what the government has announced, there's any need to go any further. What they've done is simply going to slow down the virus to some extent ending the country. That might be important if the new variant does end up being quite dangerous. In the just as likely event that the new variant doesn't end up being particularly dangerous, I think I'd like to see the restrictions go away as quickly as possible.
Morning, Matthew. Darren here. Isn't the point, though, that actually this time round, in some quarters, the government has actually been praised because they seem to be being almost proactive in all of this? There was criticism, wasn't there, back this time last year, and certainly in April, that the government weren't acting quickly enough. It seems that's not the case this time.
Well, you're going to get criticism on both sides. I think some people are going to say that these restrictions have announced ridiculous. Some people are going to say, as we saw at the press conference with the Prime Minister over the weekend, well, why aren't you basically cancelling Christmas at this point? But I think both reactions are absurd. I think the government has actually been quite proportional. It is good that they've acted relatively clear on the borders. It does make sense to try to slow it down a bit while you're trying to get an idea of what this variant is actually going to mean in practice, give you some more time to do those boosters. I don't know why we've waited so long to do boosters for the whole population, but now that'll be coming, as well as give us some time to update the vaccines and ensure that if this is a serious variant, or in case that there are more serious variants in future, we've got a good process in place where we can very quickly update the vaccines, ensure that the rapid regulatory approval, and then manufacture them and distribute them before that there's a problem in the population. The goal here now is living with COVID. There are always going to be more variants of COVID, just like there's probably going to always be more variants of the flu. Now, we've learned to live with the flu through a very smart process where we track the flu, we understand where it's spreading in the southern hemisphere and then in the northern hemisphere. We design the vaccine, we update the vaccine, we encourage people, particularly those who are vulnerable, to get the flu vaccine, and then we continue with our lives. We don't need constant authoritarian restrictions in future once we've got that process down pat.
And I sent out a tweet over the weekend saying, look, if I have to wear a mask to go to the shop, the odd trip to the shop, and sort of on my daily commute, I will, but I won't put up with any lockdowns or not being able to see my family and my loved ones. The reaction to that I got was, give them they take an inch, give them an inch and they'll take a mile, basically. Do you think that some people are basically going to say, I don't want to abide by any restrictions purely on the basis that this is going to be used by the government as a way to get me to sort of make me afraid, to get me to comply with all the other restrictions? Because that's something that's coming through from a lot of people. It's moved very much from the medical arguments to the civil liberties argument.
Look, I think it's about what's proportional. So asking people to wear masks when they go shopping, it's probably not going to have a huge effect on reducing COVID spread, but always, as you've rightly pointed out, particularly inconvenient. What would be disproportional would be, let's say, banning gatherings to some extent, or making everyone quarantine for, let's say, 8 days, as we've heard some calls, people coming into the country. You've got to think about what is a relatively low cost and high benefit move. I think that the lowest cost and highest benefit move was banning flights from those southern African countries, slowing down the spread a bit. I think the reintroduction of masks in some settings is relatively low cost, but probably relatively low benefit. And you're not going to get a huge reduction as a result. So I think that's the kind of framework we need to use. What is proportional and reasonable, and criticize the government when they do go too far with restrictions, as I think they have in the past, and held on to them for far too long.
Okay, Matthew, appreciate your thoughts and time.
Yeah.
Matthew Lesh.